Welcome everyone to the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Susie Porter, the director of the center, and I'm delighted today to have with us Dr. Nora Jaffary from the History Department at Concordia University. Dr. Jaffary will give a talk today entitled Abortion in Mexico, A History of Permission and Prohibition. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jaffary and then jump into her talk. Dr. Jaffary received her PhD in Latin American history from Columbia University in the year 2000. Her research focuses on social and gender history in colonial and 19th century Mexico. She published a monograph on the Mexican Inquisition's investigation of popular religious practices. That book is titled False Mystics, Deviant Orthodoxy in Colonial Mexico. She also published a volume of essays addressing the comparative colonization of the Americas titled Gender, Race, and Religion in the Colonization of the Americas. And she is also the author of two collections of primary sources in translation that are aimed at introducing students to Mexican history and to Mexican women's history. The one volume is Women in Colonial Latin America, Texts and Context, 1526 to 1806, which she edited with Jane Mangan, and Mexican History, a Primary Source Reader, co-edited with Edward Osovsky and Susie Porter. Her book, Reproduction and Its Discontents in Mexico, Childbirth and Contraception from 1750 to 1905, was published by UNC Chapel Hill in 2016. That book surely informs her talk today and examines midwifery, monstrous births, infanticide, abortion, and the emergence of Mexican obstetrics. For this book, Jaffary won the Canadian Historical Association's Wallace K. Ferguson Prize in 2017, an honorable mention from the Latin American Studies Association and its award, the Howard F. Klein Book Prize in Mexican History in 2018. I've known Dr. Jaffary for a very long time and have always been a huge admirer and fan of her work. And I'm delighted to be able to have her with us today to talk about the history of abortion in Mexico. So without further ado, Dr. Jaffary.
Okay, thank you very much, Susie, for the introduction and the invitation to speak with you today about a topic that is on the minds of many right now in the United States and around the world, because we are coming up on the 50-year anniversary of the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade. And as you probably know, there have been a lot of recent efforts in legislation and in the judiciary to kind of tighten abortion access in the United States. So in September of 2021, the US Supreme Court upheld a Texas law criminalizing abortion once fetal activity could be detected, which is at 6 weeks, and empowering any citizen to sue anybody else, from an Uber driver to a physician who aids and abets a pregnant person seeking an abortion. And there are about 30 other states in the US right now that are engaging in passing increasingly restrictive abortion law, and we're awaiting a decision this summer on a law from legislation in Georgia that many believe is going to overturn the legal foundation of Roe versus Wade. So this is the moment that we're in the United States, but you might be interested to know that this moment really contrasts directly with the situation in much of Western Europe and in the Americas. So in the last few years, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina all passed legislation decriminalizing abortion in the first or second trimester. And last September, and actually the same week that that the Supreme Court upheld that law in Texas, Mexico's Supreme Court issued a ruling declaring that criminalizing abortion was unconstitutional. And that ruling followed roughly 20 years of increasingly permissive legislation in Mexico increasing access to abortion. That a lot of it starts in the capital city of Mexico City, but it also has other origins as well. So in my presentation today, what I want to do is take you through the legal and judicial history of abortion access in Mexico. And we're going to go all the way back to the colonial period and then move quickly up to the 20th century and the 21st century. So I'm going to try to cover this whole time period. And before I start going through the history, what I want to do to begin with is to go over two principal arguments that I make in this presentation. So the first of them is that the condemnation of abortion in Mexico is the historic aberration rather than the norm. There are several legal conditions and long stretches of time in Mexican history when the law or courts or everyday Mexicans tolerated abortion. And the second general point I want to make is that opposition to abortion historically in Mexico did not take the expression that it does in the present. And its present expression is really quite recent. And by recent, I mean, it's been current in the last 50 years. But if we go back to older periods, we find that the current framing of abortion, which I'm sure, as you know, pits the idea of the rights of the fetus versus the rights of the pregnant person as two, sort of two competing jurisdictions. But that language did not animate understandings of abortion, toleration for abortion, or ideas about when it should be more strongly condemned in the past. And instead, historically, all concern about abortion and whether it was permitted or when it was the most strongly condemned was focused exclusively on the figure of the woman and the scrutiny of her sexual or reproductive practices and their relationship to her honor, but had nothing to do with the discussion of the fetus did not enter the picture historically. So it's a very different background in the past to how abortion is viewed more recently. Okay, so let me start to go through the different time periods that I'll talk about today. And I'm starting with the colonial period. So this is the era from when the Spanish first enter the territory until the independence from Spain, so 1519 to 1821. I'll cover this period very quickly. What I want to say is that early historians who studied abortion in the early history of Mexico, and actually carrying on in through the 19th century, had traditionally argued that women practiced very little contraception and virtually no abortion in the colonial period, that they didn't exert control over their reproduction. And that's something that I challenged in the book that Susie mentioned, and I've continued to find more evidence for it, that women actually, prior to contact with Spain and then continuing through the colonial period and long after it, used a variety of means of controlling reproduction, generally through the ingestion of botanical medicines that induced miscarriages. So that's the form that abortion took. It was medicinal abortion that provoked early labor and provoked miscarriages. And there were about a dozen different plants, or perhaps more than that, I've come across about a dozen, that served this function, served and operated in this way. And the most commonly used one was a plant called Cihuapatli that is pictured here. It In English, that plant translates to the aster flower, and it had a variety of different species. And this is the image, the illustrations of Cihuapatli from Francisco Hernandez's tract. He was a Spanish physician and naturalist. And this is a tract of his that was published later in the 17th century, but he was doing this research in the 16th century. And I found a lot of evidence of Cihuapatli's use in the colonial period, but as I said, also carrying on to much later periods. And I'll just give you one example of it showing up in the 19th century. And this came from a report that was created by an investigation of a commission of the Public Health Board. And the Public Health Board was anguishing about the sale of products like Cihuapatli in public markets. And some of the commissioners had secretly gone to a stall in a market in Mexico City called the Mercado Volador and purchased from the vendor many plants, including Cihuapatli. They also bought marijuana and falsa belladonna, which is another plant that acts as an abortifacient. And the commissioners were anguishing about this, and they wrote in their report, as is evident, anyone can easily obtain an abortifacient or any other of the most poisonous, potent plants. So there's a lot of, that's just one example, but there is considerable evidence of women using these plants. And I see them as the kind of early version of the most commonly used form of abortion in the present, which continues to be medicinal, but it's through pharmaceuticals. The two most common being the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol. And those are both drugs that have been available in Mexico without prescription since the 1980s, and now represent at least half of all abortions there, and probably will have an increased practice of abortion in the United States as well, although those two pharmaceuticals are also ones that people are using in the States as well now. So I found quite a lot of evidence, as I said, of this practice of abortion, but I mentioned earlier, historians had said there really wasn't abortion earlier. And I think the reason that they thought that was that it is a crime that was very infrequently prosecuted. So I've been searching for criminal evidence of the crime of abortion and its treatment for about 15 years, as have many other historians. And for the whole colonial period, in my search of 10 different archives, I've only located 4 cases, criminal cases for the crime of abortion in that whole 300-year period. Whereas, other violent crimes have, there are hundreds and thousands of cases, but for this one type of crime, there's very little. So that's one of the things that leads me to that conclusion, that it's an act that was tolerated. It's meant to be punishable. The most important law code that was salient in the colonial period says that abortion should be punished with the death penalty, but it is rarely denounced. And even when it is denounced, judges don't treat it harshly. So of those 4 cases, one is not pursued. In one case, the defendant escapes before sentencing, and in 2 others, the defendants are put in deposito, which is a form of supervised custody. So courts don't treat it harshly, and the public doesn't denounce it, even though it seems that it was a practice that women were frequently engaging in. Okay, so let me turn to the post-independence period. And so Mexico severs from Spain in 1821. For the purposes of the regulation of abortion and the practice of abortion, what we see for the first 5 decades after independence is great continuity. The practices continue and the denunciation rates remain quite low. There is some increase, but it's not dramatic. The legal system also does not change dramatically in these first 5 decades after independence. So what I'm going to focus on is the late 19th century, when Mexico develops its first Republican liberal penal codes. And the first of these is in 1871. So a couple points to understand about the penal codes are these. First of all, Mexico is a federation of states, of 32 states. And for criminal law, each state has its own code and regulates its own law. There are a few crimes that are under the jurisdiction of the national government, but generally it's done by state. So when I say the Penal Code of 1871, I'm talking about Mexico City's penal code, or the Distrito Federal's penal code, which was this one issued in 1871. And in about the first 15 years after that issuing, all the other states adopt it. And most of them adopt it, almost verbatim. Sometimes they change a little bit, but generally what happens in Mexico City in this first instance is passes eventually to all of the states. And the same thing happens with the revision of the code in 1931. So this code of 1871 is really the foundation of the modern penal codes across the country. There's kind of modification with it, but what is put in the 1871 code remains really the backbone, at least for about a century. So I'll return to the modifications in a little bit. And so I want to mention a few things about this code. First of all, the person who authored the sections of the code treating abortion and also infanticide was a physician. His name is Luis Hidalgo y Carpio. And one of the interesting things about him is that he was an advocate of what contemporaries called therapeutic abortions. So therapeutic abortions, as they sound like, were abortions deemed necessary, medically necessary for women. And you can see that this is like a distinction that the code makes in the way the 1871 code defines abortion. So I've translated it here. I'll just read you this little excerpt. So this is Chapter 9, Article 569 of the 1871 Code, defining abortion as, quote, the extraction of the product of conception and its expulsion provoked by any means at any point in the pregnancy when this was done without necessity, que se haga sin necesidad. So that implies that there are times when provoking the extraction of the product of conception is necessary. And when it is necessary, it's not an abortion. And the situation when it is necessary generally involved a whole set of medical conditions affecting pregnant women that Hidalgo y Carpio and many of his contemporaries thought meant that it was important that therapeutic abortions be available. And so there's a lot of publications, journal articles, medical theses from this time period addressing this matter of the situations under which therapeutic abortions should be available. And they included such conditions as narrow pelvises. This was a particular fascination for Mexican obstetricians, uterine tumors, uncontrollable vomiting or bleeding, heart conditions, and also something called the retroversion of the uterus. And that referred to a person whose anatomy was such that the uterus instead, most often a uterus tilts a little bit forward. But if the uterus is either more vertical or tilts backward toward the tailbone, it's considered retroverted, and that's a condition affecting roughly 20% of all women. So there, as you can see from this list, and there are other items in it, many, many people would have a condition that would mean doctors could judge that an abortion was medically necessary to them because it would threaten their life to carry on with the pregnancy or the child or the labor. And so what I found in this period is that from the 1880s till roughly the 1940s, there is a whole kind of school of obstetrical medicine that is teaching students, educating medical schools and publishing literature on these forms of therapeutic abortion, that it is part of institutional medicine. So this again is part of my argument for saying that abortion is tolerated, abortion is accepted, and then there are conditions in which it is not allowed, but it's much more permitted than you might expect from the current climate about abortion. A couple other things to point out about the way the 1871 code treated abortion. First of all, these are all also places that the code allowed for abortion. So one was if the abortion was attempted but not completed, then it's not criminalized. And I have another, what was the other one? There's one other situation, which is escaping me at the moment. It will come to me later. Oh yes, I remember. It's if the abortion is, if the woman can prove that it was accidental rather than intentional, it's also not considered a criminal abortion. Okay, the final thing I want to mention about the 1871 code is this matter about honor, because this is really crucial. And this is where I start making the argument about the conditions that only involve the assessment of the woman's status and her behavior rather than concern about the status of the fetus. So generally the punishment for abortion was 2 years imprisonment. But a woman, a defendant, would only receive 2 years in imprisonment for an abortion if she fulfilled 3 conditions. And these are the conditions. She has to be a woman who is not of ill repute. The code says, que no tenga mala fama. She has to have hidden the pregnancy, and she has to have not been impregnated within marriage. So if you have an abortion and you're married and the pregnancy comes from the marriage, that is seen as much more serious than if you had an abortion that is created from, or that responds to a pregnancy from outside of marriage. I won't go into more detail about that at the moment, although we can discuss it afterward if you have questions about that. But I think that is a really persuasive argument for this notion that assessing the legitimacy of having an abortion or the severity of having one didn't have, the main concern was not about the status of the fetus. The fetus doesn't come into the discussion. It's all about the behavior and assessment of the woman involved. Okay, so that's the state of law starting in 1871. And I'll just say a couple things about the kind of judicial practices between 1871 and the main revision to the code, which happens in 1931. This is, in this 60-year period between 1871 and 1931, this is the peak of time that I found that the numbers of cases of women denounced for abortion rises. So there's new penal code, and there's also, I found indication of just over 200 cases of abortion in courts in that time period, which is a significant rise from the kind of trickle of cases in the earlier decades. Cases tend to not be treated with great severity. Mostly the punishment is a period of confinement or service in a hospital sometimes. So it is treated more harshly in the sense that there's a greater denunciation and the courts tend to pursue the cases, but it's still not condemned to the extent that, for instance, it was by the earlier code. And I've tried to spend some time figuring out why the cases rise in this 60-year period. And the best explanation I've come up with remains that the discussion of female sexual honor, this is the time when it is the most pronounced in Mexico. So the fact that it's generally peers, sometimes family members, community members are going forward to courts and sharing their concerns and their anxieties that women had aborted. Usually the language they are using when they're denouncing such activities involves assessments of gendered honor of the women they're denouncing. And I'll illustrate that just with this example that was that you saw in the advertisement for my talk today. So this was the front page of a criminal investigation for provoked abortion that I found in the judicial archives in Mérida, Yucatan, and involved two women, Facunda and Norberta Canche. And so the case was about, Facunda is actually the mother of the young woman, the 15-year-old girl or woman, who is allegedly, the mother gives her daughter an abortifacient drink. And Facunda Canche, when she goes before a court, goes before a local judge in the city of Mérida and says, I need my daughter brought home. She's creating dishonor on my family and on our household. She needs to come back and live at home with me because her daughter had moved in with her boyfriend. And then the daughter herself, when she goes before the court, first of all, she denounces her mother for having forced her to take an abortifacient drink. But the daughter, Hermenegilda, denounces her mother for being dishonorable. So they're both trading this claim of bringing dishonor in their household. So the daughter says that her mother had disgraced her honor because the mother was carrying on with a man outside of marriage, and that it was in her best interest to go and move in with her boyfriend, where at least she could have an honorable household. So it's an example of that kind of language. And they're both working class women, and they're both Mayan women, I conclude from their last name, but it's people who at this moment, that language of honor is particularly powerful. Okay, I'm going to move on to explaining some important changes that occur in the next revision of the next major penal code. So the penal code is revised in 1929, but that revision is fairly insignificant. So we're just going to skip right over it and go to the 1931 revision. And I'll just point out, for those of you who may not be experts in Mexican history, that this 1931 code is created in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, when there's, various enormous political changes that occur in Mexico between 1910 and 1920, and it's a massive 10-year civil war. So in the wake of it, there's a lot of dramatic constitutional and legal changes that happen in Mexico, and one of them is this penal code. And a lot of what happens in 1931 in terms of abortion as I've already mentioned, is the retention of what was there before, but there are three important changes to the 1931 code in the federal district, some of which are adopted elsewhere. So the most important one is that the 1931 code decriminalized abortion in cases of rape. And we think that Mexico did this partly because it was following the tradition of Western European penal codes. And many Western European countries in the wake of World War I similarly decriminalized abortion in cases of rape. And the thinking is that that is because such large numbers of women in Europe were impregnated and raped by invading soldiers. And that in the wake of that, many of these countries decided to decriminalize abortion under those circumstances. I haven't found evidence that Mexico's code was similarly addressing pregnancies from rape that occurred during the revolution, but that seems like a really obvious possibility to me, but I haven't found documentation. I'm speculating about that. Two other changes that are important in the 1931 code. One is that for the first time, the code said that abortion was also lawful and not criminalized if the producto de concepción, so the embryo or the fetus, that's what we would call it, ran the risk of death if it was not undertaken. So that means if the product of conception had a medical condition that meant it was likely to die, in any case, it was not criminal to abort. And that was referred to subsequently as the eugenic clause in the legal code. And it does get introduced in the legal code at a time when eugenics movement in Mexico is powerful and has different kinds of adherents in society. But it's also interesting that that is the only time that the fetus actually appears in the code with respect to abortion. And it appears in the code as a justification for abortion, not as a reason why abortion should be illegal. And then the final things that were different in the 30s legally was that a few of the states in Mexico, 3 states, when they are adopting their version of the 1931 code, the states of Yucatan, Chihuahua, and Chiapas all included the idea that abortion should be decriminalized or less harshly criminalized. So penalization should be lighter if defendants were experiencing extreme poverty. So poverty became a justification for abortion and to make it not, that it shouldn't be penalized or that it should be treated with lighter sentences. When women, it was often in cases where women had other children and really had no economic means to have the children. Okay, I'm going to mostly jump forward now to the end of the 20th century, but I want to make 2 comments about changes that occur mid-20th century before I do that. So 2 things to know about in the period between the 1940s and the 1970s are these. First, that there is a decline in denunciations for abortion after about 1940. So it seems to me, from what I can piece together of this history, that after the 40s, there starts being fewer and fewer women who are denounced every year, but not fewer and fewer women having abortions. So again, the statistical information for this period is a little sketchy, but from what I can piece together, somewhere between tens of thousands and by the 70s, much higher numbers, like closer to 1 million women a year are having abortions in Mexico. And yet the number of cases that show up in criminal courts are in the dozens. So we have a situation mid 20th century that, from what I can see, closely parallels the colonial period, where abortion seems to be very frequent and is not prosecuted very frequently at all. So that's one mid 20th century change. But the other one that I came across doing current research this year is that at mid-century, the one group that does start to more strongly condemn abortion is the institutional medical community. So it isn't all doctors, but I did find significant evidence of prominent obstetricians and professional associations who in the 1950s and later publish condemnations of abortion and really are wanting to move the professional position of the medical profession away from teaching about abortion practices or considering that there are medical reasons why abortion might be necessary. So it seems like the medical profession that started in the 1880s, or some sectors of it, embracing abortion by the 50s really moves away from that. Okay, so I'm going to move now to the late 20th century, which is the period that there is, again, a lot of dynamism about what happens in terms of the law surrounding abortion. So we have about 100 years of like considerable continuity from 1871 till about the 1970s. And then in the last 30 years of the 20th century, and then the first 20 years of the 21st century, again, a period of great change. And there are two main sources of pressure for these changes, starting in the 1970s, like late 60s, but really more the 70s. One of them is the advent of second wave feminism in Mexico and the appearance of grassroots feminist organizations, one of which is this group, the Coalición de Mujeres Feministas, CFM, who began in the early 1970s to lead campaigns and protests and lobby political figures and legislatures on several matters related to abortion, but including access to abortion, as well as sex education and making contraception first legal and then more widely available, as well as supporting women who are victims of rape or domestic violence. So some of the push to change abortion law comes from that sector. And then the other sector that it comes from, interestingly to me, because I didn't expect it, is the federal government. So some of the initiative to change abortion law comes from a shift in the federal government's thinking, or the state's thinking, about population. So since the 19th century, the Mexican government, like most of Latin American governments, had embraced the idea that endless population expansion was the best thing economically for the country. But starting it actually starts in the late 50s, but it becomes more pronounced in the 60s and 70s, state governors, state legislatures start saying, we can't just keep expanding, we can't afford it, we have to, they're sort of pushing to change population policy and support the idea of planned families and limiting the size of families. And so we see that in a few different things, and they're associated with the presidencies of Luis Echeverria Alvarez and Jose Lopez Portillo. So one of them is things like 1973 contraception is legalized. 1974, under Echeverria, the state revises a federal law, the federal law of population. It has many elements to it, but one of them is the declaration that the federal government is responsible for providing free family planning to Mexican citizens. And then under Echeverria also, there's a big constitutional reform in 1974, and it includes in Article 4 of the 1974 revision to the Constitution, a clause that's very important in terms of gender. And it says that, first of all, men and women are equal before the law. And secondly, and this is becomes crucial for last year's ruling on abortion, that all people have the right, and I'm quoting it now, to decide on the number and timing of their children. So built into the Constitution is this clause that deals with the spacing and regulation of children. And it was actually that clause of the Constitution that the Supreme Court last year referred to when they said that criminalizing abortion was unconstitutional. But notice it took 45 years for something that's articulated in the 1974 Constitution to be upheld in a court or in the Supreme Court. Okay, so those are some important shifts from the state level. And then the other thing that is a sort of initiator of change happens under López Portillo, who in the late 1970s begins to encourage state governors from his party, so those states that are under control of the PRI government, to revise their state penal codes and to revise them to allow for greater abortion access. Now, this is another point that I'm happy to take questions about afterward if you're interested in it. And it's very complicated. So I'm not going to go through all of the things that happen, but what I'm showing you here is a map of the current regulations of abortion in Mexico. And one of the first thing to notice is just how, like, that situation of 1871, where everybody has more or less the same practice following the DF code, it's now very different. And so it's a little bit like the same situation in the States, where there's 30 countries now, or 30 states now have passed increasingly restrictive abortion laws, and 16 have passed ones that are enshrining access to abortion. So you have a whole range in Mexico. On this map, the blue spaces are those that have the most liberal access, or it's expanded access to abortion, and the orange and pink ones are the ones that have the fewest access to abortion. So less availability. And I linked here another map that, if you're interested afterward, you could go and look at this one. I like this other map better, but it's harder to show you on a Zoom presentation. And one thing I will also say is that these state penal codes, so they start being revised in the late 70s, early 80s, and the revision carries on till after 2000. So it's carrying on until just last year even. So they're in flux, and people keep changing, and so it's really hard to keep track of exactly what's happening in each state. But there's considerable movement. And I guess the other thing I just say is that the flexibility, or the more restrictive to the least restrictive, involves the fact that in all 32 states, women who are raped have the legal right to abortion. That's true everywhere. But some places have gone back to being even more restrictive than before the 1871 code. So I think it's just in Querétaro that a woman's life, if her life is in danger, she doesn't have the right to an abortion. That's one of the most restrictive ones. Most of the other places allow it for life. The more permissive places allow it for also if a woman's health is endangered. I mentioned there's some that allow it for economic reasons. And there's also this other very odd clause that was introduced in some state legislatures starting in the late 70s, which again, I can discuss after if you're interested, but it allowed for abortion in cases of involuntary artificial insemination. So that's in about 10 different state penal codes. Involuntary artificial insemination is a justification to have an abortion. Now, yeah, I'm just gonna, it's, I can see even on Susie's face, it's a very odd situation. And I don't want to dwell on it because I have to keep my eye on the time. But anyway, we can come back to that if you're interested. So, so what we have in the 70s and 80s is this dramatic change and the range of different penal codes. I just want to mention in particular three moments that are important in this period of flux. So I'll stay on this map actually. One of them is in 1990 in Chiapas, because what's happening, especially in the 90s and the first decade of the 20th century, is that abortion, which had sort of not been on the national radar for a lot of the 20th century, it kind of explodes politically just at the end of the 20th century. And there are a few places that have sort of showdowns about it. So Chiapas in 1990 was going to revise its penal code, and it was going to be much more progressive about abortion availability. And that movement is defeated, seemingly mostly due to lobbying by lay Catholic organizations. So that was 1990. 1994 in Chihuahua, that state changed its state constitution to enshrine the idea that life begins at conception. So it put that in the state constitution rather than the penal code. And after 2007, when Mexico City grants, it's the first place to grant the right to abortion in the first trimester, 17 other state constitutions did the same thing, passed this constitutional amendment saying that life begins at conception. So it came out very strongly right at the end of the century. And then the other really important moment of conflict that I want to mention, because it set the stage for what happened just last year, is this criminal case involving a 14-year-old girl, Paulina del Carmen Ramirez Jacinto. And this case is known in Mexico as the Paulina case. It became a real flashpoint and center for mainly for the pro-choice movement. And let me describe what happened. So she was a teenager who is raped in a home invasion in Mexicali, Baja Mexico in 1999. And as a victim of rape, she had the legal right to an abortion, which the state attorney general said that, she did. And then when she went with her mother to the Mexicali General Hospital to have the procedure done, no doctor would perform it. And she kept, eventually there was sort of legal barriers put in her place, and she basically was cut off from being able to access a legal abortion. And so she had to bring the pregnancy to term and have the baby. After that happened, her supporters and family took her case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And that body sued the Mexican federal government and the state government of Baja California and won. and they won both a settlement for Carmen Ramirez Jacinto herself, but they also won some legislative changes. And one of them was the requirement that the Mexican government adopt something called the Norma Oficial Mexicana 46, number 46. So a Norma Oficial Mexicana, we don't, as far as I know, we don't have anything like this in the US or in Canada, but it's, so this would be a federal law. It's like a regulation governing, in this case, government services. You can also have Norma Oficial Mexicanas governing private services, but it governs public health, social service institutions. And this norm required that such institutions provide abortions to women and girls impregnated in instances of rape who requested the service. So as you know, this was in the penal code that I mentioned from 31. It's in every state's penal code, but it hadn't been enacted. And so this was kind of a way to enforce the adoption of what had been law since 1931. And then this is the final point I'll make about this Paulina case, was that the Supreme Court of Mexico last September, when they passed the law that I've mentioned a couple times, saying that criminalizing abortion was unconstitutional, a few days after that, they also issued a decision here about, and it was really a reaction again to the Paulina case. They issued a decision about a revision to the general health law that had come into place in law in 2018. And that 2018 law had said that health workers had the right to conscientiously object to performing certain medical operations or providing certain medical services. And what those services really were abortion. So the Supreme Court said that health workers could not remove themselves for like personal conscientious questions from their obligations to ensuring patients' rights to health care. So it was again addressing that history that I alluded to of the medical profession distancing itself from the obligation or requirement to provide abortion. And the Supreme Court is, it says, kind of tells the medical profession, this is the law and this is your obligation. So I'm going to end there, but just as I'm closing, I just want to return back to the two main arguments that I made and remind you of them. And I hope you've been able to see, as I've been talking, the places where this shows up. So one of the arguments was that even though in the present we think of abortion as this struggle between fetal rights and women's rights, historically, we see very little of that conversation. And that conversation is a kind of product of the late 20th century, from the 80s and 90s and onward. But historically, it's significant to me that that discussion does not appear historically. And what does appear historically is a focus and concern with observing and scrutinizing the sexual practice and gendered honor of pregnant women. And one place we see that really explicitly is the fact that those clauses that I mentioned about honor and abortion, the things that I pointed out about the 1871 code, those instances when women were prosecuted more for having an abortion, those are still in the text of the law now in 6 states in Mexico. So when all of those places were revising their penal codes starting in the 80s, Jalisco, Nayarit, Oaxaca, Tamaulipas, Zacatecas, and Yucatan decided still made sense to keep in that women who were of ill repute or got pregnant inside marriage or had not hidden their pregnancies, they deserve to be treated with greater severity than other women. So the question of the sort of evaluations of gendered honor is certainly still alive and strong today. Okay, so I will stop talking now, and I'd be happy to address any questions or comments from all of you.
Thank you so much. That was a very rich talk, and I'm impressed with your capacity to synthesize centuries of history in a way that's so compelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
So we have some questions coming in. I want to invite everyone in the audience to think of some questions and to send them in, and I will be posting them and posing them for Dr. Jaffary to respond to. We have two questions that came through related to the relationship between, or the way that basically that ethnicity has impacted the implementation or use of or maneuvering around laws. So the first question is, were the rules different for Indigenous women or Afro-Mexican women compared to European women? And that question came in particular with at the moment of the colonial era.
Mm-hmm.
And relatedly, I know we're talking about the 19th century, so then moving on to the 19th century, but Kellen, who asks the question, says, I wonder about Afro-Mexican women seeking abortions to avoid their children being born into slavery status, and if that happened, to what extent?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the letter of the law, there is no special provision for people of different ethnicities in any of the codes. And in the colonial period, what law people are using, what law courts are using, is largely for criminal law. They're largely using medieval and early modern Spanish law. So the text I referred to is the Siete Partidas, which is a 13th century code, and it's the one that, when this topic comes up, that's the thing that judges cite. And so, it's created in the 13th century and it's conceived of for Seville. So that's who it's talking about. But so there isn't in the law differentiation by ethnicity. And that carries on. That's true in the modern codes as well. But the one place I will say that we see that the question of sort of sexual practice and honor shows up in a related manner is that, and my talk today was all about abortion, but I've studied abortion often in conjunction with studying infanticide, because even though we think of these as very different phenomenon, in the past, they were like the line between them was often not that clear. And there's actually more generation of evidence about infanticide, and there's more prosecution of it. So there is an institution that the colonial state creates, partly to deal with the fear of infanticide. So this was a clinic that was within the Mexico City poorhouse for women to go to if they were pregnant and it was going to cause dishonor, and they wanted to be able to have a secret birth that no one would know about. They could go to this, it was called the Departamento de Partos Secretos in the Mexico City poorhouse, and they didn't have to reveal their identities, and they could have a birth in secret. And the state came up with this, and with church support, as a way to avoid the problem of infanticide. But significantly, that institution was really only for women of Spanish descent. So the clauses governing who can use it makes clear it's for Spanish women and not for African women and not for Indigenous women. And that's the only time I can think of this issue. So the imperative of protecting public honor and the anxiety about sort of the preservation of virtue and those kinds of concerns, they are more, there's a perception that it matters more, I guess I would say, for Spanish women, especially women who are trying to become part of or are part of the elite. And then the question about African women and abortion, I mean, it's really interesting history. And it isn't, I mean, there's, I found very little information about this topic in the colonial period in Mexico. There is a lot more information about African women and the question of abortion and medical abortion, specifically as you asked about, to avoid bringing offspring into enslavement. I found information about that in the Caribbean and a little bit in Colombia, where there is some documentation about it, but I haven't found any in Mexico. And I also haven't found evidence about medicine that seems to have an African origin or is knowledge within African communities. So the only evidence I found has to do with the indigenous population and medicines that were known to pre-Columbian women in indigenous communities. It may be because, it may be a demographic thing. So while there is like 17% of the population of Mexico is African descended at independence, but we don't have kind of the large plantations of enslaved laborers of African origin that we have in places like Peru or in the Caribbean in this later period when there's more documentation. So I think that's why I haven't been able to trace that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Professor Benjamin Cohen in the history department at the University of Utah. And he asks, were there any famous or scandalous abortion cases from the 19th century that became public events?
Yeah.
I'm currently working on one such case from the late 19th century in India.
Yes, there is one case that I know of, and I haven't written about it very much. I put a little bit of it in Reproduction and Its Discontents, but you can find a bigger discussion of it in, will I remember the name of the book? What's the name of the book? This is one of those things. I'm going to forget it right now. It'll come to me in 2 minutes. The name of the doctor involved was Abriego. And so he's a doctor who his case is quite scandalous. It goes before it's in the newspapers, it goes to the Supreme Court, and he's accused of having provided an abortion to a woman he was having an affair with, who was also his nursing assistant. And she dies, and her family, sort of turns this into, there's a big scandal about was he practicing abortion, providing abortion. The guy who wrote about it, I think I just brought the book home from my office in the last week. Oh, what's it called? It's James. Help me out here, Susie.
Send us an email with it.
Vice. It's like about 19th century vice in the Porfirian era.
I mean, Pablo Picato?
Not Pablo, but it's like, James Garza. The book, author is James Garza. Yeah, if you look up James Garza and Porfiria in Mexico, you'll find it. I can't remember the name of the book now, but I'll
get that for you. Yeah, thank you. So we have some more questions coming in. Susie Jones, who's a graduate student in the history department, is asking, what made the institutional medical field opposed to abortion in the 1970s?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think so. A couple of things. I think that the medical field, so the earliest evidence I found of the like professions sort of distancing themselves from it is earlier. I think it starts, sorry, the earliest ones I found were in the 50s. And what I found were things like individual doctors who had even previously published about performing therapeutic abortions and the techniques, then showing up at like medical association meetings and saying, you know, this is terrible, we have to stop doing this, it should be criminal. When they do that, the argument that they say is that medicine has advanced sufficiently that there's no reason to have to provide abortion. So like if women have problems like heart conditions or high blood pressure, that there are enough treatments that they can deal with those medical problems and that abortion isn't necessary. So that's the kind of technical reason they give. But the other thing that comes up, and I don't know if I have a good answer for this, but I can tell you what shows up in their statements. And then the other thing is like panels and papers given at professional meetings of medical, like gynecological organizations or obstetrical organizations. You have people showing up and giving a sort of like a learned talk on this. And they start talking a lot more about their Catholic objections. So this is the one like, and this I find very odd, but the source of religious objections to abortion comes from what I can see, it comes from within medicine. But it didn't come from within medicine in the 19th century. And yeah, so I was explaining this to a colleague of mine, and she put it this way, and I don't, like, I'll just tell you what I thought about it, but I'm not sure if this is true. But this is what I got. So what happens in Mexico in terms of the church's power is that there's sort of an erosion of the political power and rights of the church that starts in the mid 19th century. I mean, some people say it starts in the mid 18th century, but it's more pronounced in the mid 19th century. And so there's this expansion of the state's power versus the church's power over things like, you know, marriage and education and property. And after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, one of the other articles of the first post-revolutionary constitution is that the state is banned from having the right to speak publicly on political matters. Like they are removed kind of from having a say in public discourse. And it wasn't as strong as that in the 19th century. So one idea I have is that, or that my colleague helped me think of, is that the church has denied the power to kind of articulate some of these positions through the 20th century. And so it emerges in other venues. And then one of the things that changes, and so when I started talking about the late 20th century, how, you know, the issue of the fetus does start showing up in discourse, the rights of the fetus at birth and that kind of thing. And part of that, and then you have groups that are successfully lobbying legislatures to change abortion law that are Catholic groups. And part of that is because in 1994, the Mexican president, Carlos Salinas, changes that element of the Constitution and says the church no longer has to be banned from political activity. So yeah, I feel like there is a connection to be made there, that in the 19th century, the church actually has more say, although it isn't very public about the question of abortion in Mexico. And then in the early 20th century, it's banned. And so maybe some of, you know, the other organizations speak when the church can't. And strangely enough, one of them is the medical profession. And then in the late 20th century, the the church is again permitted to have a voice. And so that's where the attention goes. So those are the two things I can think about. Why does the profession move to, condemn it in a way that it hadn't in the 19th century? But it is a question I am still puzzling with, I will say.
Yeah, no, that's a good response too. I just want to let you know that I found Garza's book and I sent it to Professor Cohen.
Oh, good. What's it called?
It is,
James Alex Garza.
The Imagined Underworld, Sex,
That's
Crime, and
it.
Vice in Porphyry in Mexico from 2008. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. So Kobe Rathsavong asks, has the conflict in Chiapas influenced or affected abortion in that region? Kobe did a wonderful presentation and research project on indigenous social movements in Latin America recently, and so has that on their mind.
Right. So you're, Kobe, I assume you're speaking about the Zapatista uprising. I mean, I think, well, if we look at this map, I'm going to go to my different district maps. So Chiapas is one of the places that has more, it's kind of on the more permissive, it's sort of in the middle side currently for how much is allowable or like accessible. And I mentioned that Chiapas had been going to, this would have been before the 1994 uprising in Chiapas, but had been planning to revise its constitution to be more permissive. And then that was defeated. That's in 1990. It's also one of the places that I mentioned that has the, I'm just going to verify, but I'm quite certain is one of the places that in 1938, decriminalizes abortion for poverty. So I don't know if I would say that it's I don't think that the 1994 uprising changes the legislation, because those things that I just mentioned predate the 1994 uprising. But I think the thing that I would say is that it's and you probably know this from your research about that uprising. There's these two traditions in Chiapas of the powerful and potent presence of Mayan communities, and they would be, and also a place that has, is one of the poorest states, if not the poorest state in Mexico. So that's why there is an acknowledgement of things like permission of abortion in cases of economic need. But then it also has the very powerful, like Catholic, much more conservative tradition. So those things, I think, had a role in Chiapas in the 1994 uprising, but and the same conditions also affected, abortion in the cases that I've mentioned. But I don't think that the uprising itself had a connection to abortion law.
One of the things that some of the students in at this event are in a class on gender and power in Latin America this semester, and one of the things that we've talked about has been the unpacking the role of the Catholic Church in regarding different issues. So, for example, thinking about LGBTQ social movements, and finding that certainly there are ways that the Catholic Church has played a limiting role on people's rights, but that there are other factors too. And I think that, so for example, the rise of evangelical religions throughout Latin America have impacted and limited LGBTQ rights in Latin America. And I think in terms of popular perceptions, many people might say Mexico has limited abortion for so long because of the power of the Catholic Church. And you spoke to this a little bit already, but how would you respond to that question? Or maybe counter that perception that this is a history of the waxing and waning of the power of the Catholic Church?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, that is usually the first thing people say to me about working on this topic in Mexico is, oh, it must have been so prohibited for so long because the Catholic Church is so strong there. And that's, again, so I have spent some time trying to see what is the impact of the Catholic Church. And this takes me to that main point I made about that present moment is very different from the past. And everything I have found about the condemnation of abortion in the past is that there was very little discussion of Catholic matters in it before the late 20th century. So, we could talk about the waxing and waning of the church, because it definitely did play a role starting in at least the 1980s. But what surprised me was how little a role it seemed to have played before that. So going back to the period of reproduction and its discontents, when I started researching this, I started coming across material on abortion when I was working on my first book, which brought me through a lot of Inquisition material. And when the Inquisition cases I would read brought up something to do with abortion, I kind of paid attention. So the Catholic, there are these different moments in church history and the institutional history of the church when the papacy condemns abortion. So there's one famous one in 1588, and there's another one in the 17th century, and then there's a couple in the 19th century. So there is the papacy on the one hand does have these pronunciations, but in practice, the fact that the papacy said something, there's a huge disconnect, and no one's really paying attention to that in New Spain or even really in Mexico. So I found, Inquisition cases where a priest denounced himself to the Inquisition for having provided abortion or procured abortions for his daughters of confession that he'd gotten pregnant. And the Inquisition was like, we're not interested. We're not pursuing this. It wasn't something they were particularly concerned with, even though it was meant to be, it was meant to be condemned. They're a lot more concerned with something like bigamy or polygamy or even blasphemy. These are the things that they're concerned with numerically, if we look at what kinds of cases are they investigating. And then, in the 19th century, I mentioned there are a couple of 19th century pronunciations by the papacy about that affect abortion. And there's another one in the early 20th century. So I spent some time in the last year reading newspaper databases, because it's a COVID-friendly activity for research. And I was just trying to track, is there evidence that when the papacy made this pronouncement, that people were, publishing about it or talking about it in Mexican newspapers? And I found that they weren't. The papacy says abortion is a sin, or marriage is sanctified, et cetera, and no one, they talked a lot more about a different declaration by the papacy in the late 19th century that affected workers, rerum novarum, that talked about the rights of workers. People see it as this kind of important precedent to liberation theology in the 1970s. So that got a lot of, I found many hits to that kind of discussion in Mexican newspapers. And in the 1930s, the Mexican Archbishop in Mexico City issues a kind of speech, again, like an anti-abortion speech. And it's also, it's in response to a papal edict that is condemning homosexuality, prostitution, and abortion. And it gets a little more like there's a little bit more activity around that one. I found some, and there's some organizations that pick up on it. But what I mostly found is that even though we do know, Mexico and Mexicans identify strongly as Catholics, even when the state has said everybody is secular, but it doesn't seem like it's something that informs morality. Like abortion is not something that people are taking strong moral positions on. I found that judges who are assessing criminal cases involving abortion, and I'm thinking mostly here of the 19th century and early 20th century, I've read probably 300, cases that treat this crime or the related crime of infanticide. And I've only found like one or two where a judge scolds a defendant. In one case, a judge says, your child is going to be in limbo because you did this. And what was striking, like that one case really struck me because it was the only time someone said something like that. And most of the time they're just like, well, what I found surprising about it is just the absence of that very moralistic and religious kind of discourse, which is so strong in like the last 20 years, but not strong at all earlier. So that's mainly what I say, is that I expected to find it a lot, and I didn't find it a lot, although I did find a lot of discussion about gendered honor. Like that's what people were talking about, rather than talking about necessarily being religious or adhering to church law.
So you've been very generous with your research and your assessment of this history, and I think we'll just wrap up with one last question.
Sure.
Thinking about the debate, historiographical debate maybe is too strong, but people discuss the relative role of, on the one, in regard to birth control and family planning in the 1970s. On the one hand, people have argued that women and the feminist movement mobilized for those rights, and other people would argue that really, in fact, it was the Mexican government's concern with population control and the place of population expansion in economic well-being and development.
Yeah.
So thinking about that, to what degree do you think the feminist movement played a role in leading to the Supreme Court, the recent Supreme Court decision and the expansion of abortion rights for women in Mexico?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting, complicated history. And one of the parts that that I found so odd was this moment when, in the 70s, in the late 70s, when Lopez Portillo says, to the state governors, like, go and revise your penal codes and let's have more access. And there's a political scientist who, Adriana Ortiz Ortega, who has worked on abortion since the 1990s. And she wrote her, she did her PhD, she's Mexican, but she did her PhD at Yale. And I found her doctoral dissertation, and then she's continued to publish about it. And one of the things that she highlights about this strange thing that happens in the late 70s when these codes start to be revised is how much secrecy was surrounded those revisions. When the map that I've got on there now, when that map began to be created in the way that allowed for some places to be more liberal and others not. And she says that one thing was that they did it secretly because they were trying to avoid opposition by the church, but doing it secretly also meant that women themselves didn't know that the law had been changed. And she has this, like, it almost sounds, like unbelievable that this happened, but she has this I'll see if I can quickly find the quotation, but she talks about how the codes weren't published. They weren't put in, I won't be able to find it. They weren't put in the press. No one acknowledged the changes. And so it's this bizarre thing where, and I think that she talks about the fact that women's groups, and like the one that I mentioned, the Coalición de Mujeres Feministas, they are responsible for pushing legislatures as well to do this revising, but then the revising is so secretive. It's hard to know. I mean, the codes are changed, but does anyone know the codes are changed? And one of the places that we see this is actually in 2000. Mexico City's, the capital is the first place that kind of makes the debate public. So there's a Mexico City, she is at the time, she's the mayor of Mexico City. Her name is, Robles is her surname. Robles introduces legislation to amend the law. And actually what Mexico City is doing in 2000, is the same as many of the other states had done. So they're trying to expand abortion to allow it when women's health is threatened, when the fetus has serious medical conditions, and also in this weird thing about the artificial and involuntary insemination. But that case becomes huge, and that's one of the cases that really brings it to public attention and is challenged by to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upholds it. But I think one of the reasons why that 2000 case is important in Mexico City is because of this issue, because it was public. So I don't know, I guess I would say that in that case, if we took that one as one of the most important moments, it's not an either or thing. I mean, Robles is a political figure, but she's the forerunner to she's involved in the creation of the PRD, or she's the second PRD, district capital city mayor. And so she's got that, but she's also, influenced by contemporary feminist. So it's both things. She's kind of indicative of both of those influences coming together. But the place that I would say, I was thinking about, what is responsible for the change in Mexico, including the Supreme Court decision from 2021 saying that criminalizing abortion is unconstitutional. And, I spent some time just looking. I don't know the individual, I can't name you actually even one Supreme Court judge, but I've just looked at some of I was looking at their website, looking at their pictures, and there are women on the Supreme Court, mainly men, and they're like educated middle-class men. And it's kind of interesting looking at them and thinking, look at this radical, like what seems to me at this moment like a radical claim that they're making. And I guess again, I would say it's both, but the fact that the Supreme Court makes an argument or upholds this change that was in the Constitution since 1974, that has to be a response to the society they live in, like a society that has said feminism not only has a place at the table, but it is just a given. Like we are going to assume and understand that women's rights to autonomy are, it's not even a question. It's got to be law, and it's normal civilized behavior. And so I feel like that change in mentality, that's the thing that I would say is more about the impact of the feminist movement. It's not about a particular piece of legislation, but it's about the broader notion of validating the people who are most immediately affected by such legislation.
Yes, that's a a great teasing out of the different factors and the way that decisions get made and social change comes about. Thank you so much for this project, this research, and thank you for taking the time to share it with us and for answering all of the questions that people pose. Thank you to those in the audience who posed questions and who joined us for the conversation. I think that this research project, Dr. Jaffry's research, really disentangles the role of different institutions and how they change over time and helps us think about how we're in a moment where Mexico is expanding women's access to abortion. And in the United States, we're faced with the possibility of the restriction of access to that. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.